Welcome everybody. We'll go ahead and get started. This clock is running a few minutes behind, so I'm sorry that we're starting 2 minutes late. My name is Holly Fernandez-Lynch. Welcome back to the Research Ethics and Policy series, or REPS as we like to call it. I organize REPS with my colleague Steve Jaffe, and we would both like to acknowledge the generous support of our co-sponsors of this series, which you see listed on the slide here. If you're not already on our mailing list, you should find Mary Pham, who is milling about outside, and ask to be joined to the list. And thank you to Mary for handling the logistics so beautifully on all of these events. If you are so inclined to tweet at any of our REPS lectures, the hashtag is up on the screen. We've also started to record the REPS series, and we post the videos to the Department of Medical Ethics and Health Policy website, so you can go back to them later, share them with your colleagues. I am excited to welcome you to our fall lineup. We took a quick break over the summer. And as a brief reminder, we meet the first Monday of the month, each month from 12 until 1, running from September, when Labor Day doesn't interfere, until June. And the goal of REPS is to facilitate connections between those who are working in research ethics and policy across Penn and CHOP, and to get some expert perspectives on emerging issues in these areas. So today, we are going to hear from Dr. Jonathan Moreno, who I'm going to introduce momentarily. Then next up on November 4th, we have invited Greg Gonzalez, who is a leader in the HIV community. He has decades of experience with the advocacy group, the HIV advocacy group ACT UP, and other advocacy organizations. He is a faculty member at Yale and a MacArthur Genius Award winner. And then on December 2nd, I will be bringing up the rear, giving a lecture about how we can think about evaluating the quality and effectiveness of institutional review boards. And then you can see we've already got some great names lined up for spring 2020. And then one last announcement before I get us started. We want to make sure that everyone is aware of a course that our department offers online. It's a short training course in the ethics of human research, and it's available for free to all members of the Penn and CHOP communities. Also, the course is accepted by the Penn and CHOP IRB in satisfaction of training requirements in human subjects protection. So you can take this course in lieu of the analogous city training course. We're fairly certain that you will find ours more engaging. It's brief video lectures from our expert faculty. And the course is, as I said, currently available. It's been updated to account for the revised Common Rule. And then at the end of November, we'll also be launching a totally revamped version of the course, which I'll announce here, as well as several short courses in special topics in research ethics. So if you have any questions about that, please come find me or send me a message and I can give you more information. All right, those are our housekeeping notices. We can now move on to the main event. It's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Jonathan Moreno. Dr. Moreno is the David and Lynn Silfen University Professor here at Penn, where he is also a Penn Integrates Knowledge Professor. In 2008 to 2009, he served as a member of President Obama's transition team, during which time he had responsibility for helping to organize the Presidential Commission for the Study of Bioethical Issues, which I think is where our paths first crossed. That commission was chaired by Dr. Amy Gutman. Dr. Moreno was awarded the Lifetime Achievement Award by the American Society for Bioethics and Humanities in 2018 in recognition of his remarkable career and body of work. He's a leading expert in the history of research ethics as well as its many modern challenges. And I would be remiss if I failed to note that Drs. Moreno and Gutman have a new book out together with the fabulous title, Everybody Wants to Go to Heaven, but Nobody Wants to Die. The book examines the inevitable moral choices that come along with medical progress, addressing the problem of Americans wanting everything that medical science has to offer without debating its merits and limits. The book is a blend of history and public policy, and it received a riveting endorsement from Andrea Mitchell of NBC News, who called it required reading for everyone with a heartbeat, which I think counts everyone in this room. And with that, I will turn things over to Dr. Moreno for his lecture. Thank you.
Thank you, Holly. And thank you for showing up today. So, yeah, since I got that Lifetime Achievement Award, I figure nothing left to prove. I may as well just stumble along. And in fact, this talk actually is a certain amount of stumbling along. I'm trying to figure something out. So we have these work in progress talks in our department, Medical Ethics and Health Policy, and this is sort of a work in progress, as you'll see, because the issues that I'm interested in are still very much ongoing. So for those of you who have had better things to do for the last 25 years than pay attention to me, I have long been interested in how the field of bioethics operates in a geopolitical context. And I first got interested in this in the mid-90s when I worked for President Clinton's Advisory Committee on Human Radiation Experiments, where we were interested in, I became interested in how human experiments and the ethical standards that we've developed for human experiments developed partly in a national security context. So obviously the Nuremberg Code came out of the Holocaust and the concentration camp experiments, many of which were sponsored by the German military during World War II, but that's a different talk. Related to that, a much slower field to develop was getting an understanding of the Imperial Japanese experiments in Manchuria during World War II. And that's another topic that is quite fascinating. But when I became sort of, as the scales fell from my eyes in the mid-90s, I realized that much of what I was interested in bioethics really had to do with what is often called geopolitics, which the competition among states for supremacy, which sometimes happens on the battlefield, but I argue in this talk also happens in science labs. So I think we're all familiar with this episode when Hee-Jun Kui, I'll call him HJK, so I don't continually mispronounce his name, came to this the second summit on gene editing in 2017 in Hong Kong. I tried very much to get invited to that summit, but instead I had to watch it online. And he made the announcement about it turns out, the twins plus one gene-edited baby. HJK was not an isolated figure. He was an up-and-coming young scientist with lots of credentials, and he was in fact part of the 1,000 Talents program. Some people may know the 1,000 Talents program, which started sort of 2007-ish, a year after my first visit to China, which aims to bring not only young Chinese scientists, but also anybody who wants to start a lab and to help to move Chinese science along in the PRC. And HJK was part of this. In fact, according to some press reports, he is or was, I'm not sure how this is going to work now, on paper worth $500 million because he's established 7 or 8 companies for which he has an equity interest in the intellectual property. He is not a small player. He is an important person. He was an important person as it fits into the PRC's ambitions with respect to biotechnology, and also in terms of the industry of biotechnology. So I'm not going to, everybody's seen this slide a million times or one like it. I'm just going to show it to you briefly, and you can look at it again. Those of you who can actually understand how this works, you can explain it to me later, since I am a philosopher by training. I'm just doing my best. So I was also part of this, or this is just an example of how people have tried to exploit in a non-pejorative way the possibilities of CRISPR. I believe that GP Wright is now has pretty much collapsed, but this was an effort led by George Church, not a shrinking violet, by the way, if you know anything about George Church, and one of the few, I think, top scientists who pretty much defended HJK, has over the last couple of years. This was an effort to put together a kind of a consortium of good labs, good teams around the country, and develop some funding as a group, and to engage in what this group called writing the genome. Instead of just reading the genome as in the Human Genome Project and sequencing and so forth, the idea now is to write it. And so I was an ethics advisor to this group for a couple of years. And a question for this field, not just for this group, but for the field is, what's the platform in which you do this work that is ethically acceptable, right? So yeast cells, okay, that's fine. E. coli, but then do you go to haploid embryos? How far do you go? And so this is one of the considerations that this field starts to engender. So briefly, the ethical considerations, which to me, frankly, are not as much fun to talk about as the geopolitics, but we'll do that anyway, because I do work in an ethics department, at least part-time. So there are basically, I think it's fair to say, three categories of ethical issues. One is enhancement issues, right? So these are the ones that we like to think about when I do my bioethics film festival. By the way, I do that in March every year. If you haven't attended, I know who you are. We'll be doing one again next March, a little advertisement. And sometimes in my bioethics film festivals, of course, we do science fiction films. And this is a favorite topic for science fiction, starting with Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, you might argue, about 200 years ago when it was published. It generally goes bad, right? We know how those stories are. They generally don't go well. And in particular, as I like to point out in a whole other talk, it doesn't go well for the scientists, right? Because Frankenstein, of course, was not the creature. Frankenstein was the scientist. And the creature was an innocent. So we have this really, I think, heavy dark cloud over the culture of biotechnology that is, you might say, pretty much as old as modernity, right? What can go wrong when you start messing around with Mother Nature? So that's pretty transparent. Then we have the medical benefits, which are substantial, potentially substantial. So I just finished working on a National Academies committee that will be reporting out in the next few months on sickle cell. And sickle cell is a target for gene editing. And in principle, not only for your body cells, but also for your germline. This is tremendously exciting. But the paradox is that we're still not getting sickle cell therapy that is actually available to people as well as we should be now, right? So you've got this weird high-end science that people are actually starting with respect to gene editing and sickle cell. And you've got this, you might say, pedestrian public health, right? Clinical interventions, particularly after people are 18 years old who have sickle cell. So, because the money comes from different pockets and there are different politics involved with each pocket, we don't do that well. And then, of course, there are medical needs. I already mentioned sickle cell, but then there's Huntington's, and then there's IVF, PGD. But here's the big, interesting philosophical question. The National Academies Committee that reported out in February of 2017 on germline editing, or gene editing, I should say, including germline editing, they pretty much said, look, somatic cell interventions using this technology, a technology which is really one in a line of technologies that started with recombinant DNA in the 1970s, we can get our arms around that in a regulatory and ethical sense. That's one thing. We sort of know what we're doing in that area. The more challenging area is modifying the human germline. And that's what is so particularly fascinating to me and brings us into partly at least into the topic of geopolitics. So if you talk to people at Penn who work in these areas, they'll say, we are very much more constrained than our colleagues are in places like China. China manages to move ahead without the same kind of regulatory scrutiny. In theory there is scrutiny, but in fact there's a lot more softness in the system in China, and not only in China, Sante, than there is in the United States and sort of generally in the West. And so we for example had a story a year ago about 80 some odd people with cancer who were treated with somatic cell editing, and according to the news stories, these people have kind of been lost to follow-up. So that's the kind of thing that probably would not happen here, but it does mean that there's knowledge being gained that we can't gain. And I already mentioned the sickle cell project, which I hope will be released in the next few months, which will again talk about sort of high-end work on gene editing, but mainly on how to get clinical care to people who have sickle cell now. So these were the two conferences. It was the second conference where HJK made his big announcement. I just noticed that there was a kind of an evolution of the titles, right, from gene editing to genome editing. And this is if those of you who want to get up to speed on what I think is pretty much the global standard, although this came out of the US academies, pretty much the global standards. If you look at the Nuffield Council in the UK, pretty much the same thing. And as I'll come to later on, also in China itself, this pretty much articulates the standard. So the standards, again, at the moment at least, somatic cell modification, we've got a regulatory system, the FDA, we can handle that. You start getting into the germline, it's got to be something really that we can't address any other way. And in between, enhancement issues, well, that's probably not the best way to spend our money. It's unpredictable, and it probably depends on what philosophers, like the ones we have here, think enhancement really is. So the risks, benefits, and unknowns of CRISPR-style gene editing. By the way, as you know, there's also TALENs, and there are these other systems not as efficient, apparently not as easy to learn, not as easy to incorporate into your lab as CRISPR, Cas9, or whatever protein you happen to be working on. There's not only Cas9, there's Cas23, who knows all the numbers here. There's a bunch of other proteins that people are messing around with for different purposes. So you have off-target risks, which you heard about very early in this process, the unlined effects on the germline. You could maximize welfare by making, if you could make my descendants better than the two I've got so far, that would be a good thing. Don't tell them I said that. There is a problem with helping the public to understand what this all means and not getting nervous about Frankenstein. And then an old topic, one of the first topics in bioethics, really one that goes back to the early 70s at least, is you start deciding that we're going to enhance people generation upon generation, you're doing the germline stuff, what does that say about the unenhanced? And what are we saying about people who, will we all end up being disabled if we're not enhanced? Right? And all our descendants and so forth. Big philosophical issue. And then finally, what I'm going to come back to at the end, a common area of concern, no matter what country you're in, what system of science you're in, is biological weapons. Another topic that has interested me over the years. I'll come back to that. So after the scandal involving Dr. He's announcement, we had calls for a moratorium. So some of you know that in 1975, about 140 scientists got together at the Asilomar Conference Center in California and decided, one of them being Paul Berg, and some of the other recombinant DNA pioneers, decided that we should just stop doing recombinant DNA stuff for a while until we can, well, the public position was until we can figure out how to make sure we have safety measures implemented. But I think the backstory was how to keep Congress out of it. And this takes me back to my geopolitics. A lot of the proposals for moratoria, many of the interventions that the scientific community has done over the years, some committees that I've been associated with, or panels, have had as a background concern keeping the scientific community in charge of the fundamental decision making and not letting the politicians have their way with us. Because the politicians often do have their way with us, if you haven't noticed. So you have the Asilomar sort of moratorium, declared moratorium, didn't last very long. You had the National Bioethics Advisory Committee on cloning, reproductive cloning, which every president, Clinton, Bush, Obama, President Trump has not articulated a view on reproductive cloning yet, but who knows? Every president has said reproductive cloning is a bad thing. Why it's a bad thing, other than risks, I'm not so sure. Because they're identical twins, but this has been a general view. And others have noted that mitochondrial DNA, kind of yellow-green lighted in the UK, those people are coming along. Interestingly, not exactly the same kind of category, but it used to be when I taught undergraduates in bioethics courses maybe 20 years ago, I could talk about in vitro fertilization as a kind of abstraction. And then a couple of years ago, I realized when I was giving my talk to 80 plus Penn undergrads and I was giving this talk about IVF, I realized, I looked at them and said, what? Several of these people are probably IVF babies. So I think I ought to be a little more careful. 6 million plus IVF babies. I don't know if anybody really knows how many there are in the world. There are various, on the next bullet point, the moral status of the human embryo, it varies some extent from culture to culture. It has great significance here, political significance here. It doesn't have the same kind of significance in much of the rest of the world. Then you have sort of our friends in the transhumanist community. Do we have any transhumanists here, by the way? You know what that is, transhumanists? So transhumanists are a philosophical orientation. They hold a philosophical orientation, sometimes called humanity plus. I know some of you know what it is. You're just too shy. These are people who believe that we should embrace all of technology. The technology is a great thing. We should all become, data, basically, those of you who are Star Trek fans. We should all become some version of a biological and a cyber creature. It's all good. Jeffrey Epstein, by the way, is a transhumanist, so I don't think it really has helped the movement a lot. And then there's, what do we say about epigenetics? I have come over the years to say, when people ask me, what about this? What about designer babies? What do you think about that? And I would say, I've had a couple of babies, and our efforts to design them, forget about it. Anybody who's had a baby, you design, okay, you can enjoy the fantasy. Designer baby, that's a good one. But back to germline editing. So I love the history of this. I think there's an implicit notion in much of bioethics that there's a black line between somatic cell modification and germline modification. That is a black line that must not be crossed. And so I've tried to figure out where the hell this black line is that I missed. And I think that implicitly many people think that it goes back to this document that was produced in 1982 by a presidential bioethics commission called this document. You can read it. It'll take you about half an hour. It's actually really good, really good. And it's extremely contemporary in many ways. And we took hundreds of pages for hundreds of pages. Many trees have been lost writing documents that are not as concise as this one about genetic modification. And this one I think is pretty good. What's interesting about it is that there is no black line. Okay, that's the bottom line is there's no big black line in this document or any quasi-official document I can find about germline modification that distinguishes between somatic cell and germline from a moral standpoint. Now, it may be striking to you that they mention eugenics. Right? So this is the 80s. The history is in a way still fresher in the 80s than it is now. But the word eugenics still kind of, it's still over us somehow, and it's hard to escape from it. I think the term is not useful. But the point is that there is no dark line, so far as I can tell, in the literature. If anybody knows one, I'd like to see it between somatic cell and germline editing. And even this group was willing to countenance the possibility of germline editing if it should ever be plausible, if it should ever be safe, and so forth. There's a wonderful paragraph that I don't have on this slide from this report. By the way, this is a Carter appointed and then Reagan appointed commission, so it's about as bipartisan as we can get. Well, in the old days when there was bipartisanship. There's another passage from this report that is really great, which says basically, if we think that we can solve all our human problems by modifying the human germline, we've got bigger problems than modifying the human germline. So we have to be careful about the seduction of biotechnology. But in a way, we're doing this. Right? I mean, the response to germline modification, to the critics of germline modification is, wait a minute. What about, you can be a sperm donor for 100 plus kids, even if you don't know you're a sperm donor, as it turns out, right? For 100 plus kids. So I don't know how much of this is still going on. It used to be medical students who were especially attractive donors and would get, I don't know, 25, 30 bucks a shot. There's one guy in, that was a bad pun, I know. There's one guy in the Bay Area who I think has given over 120 times, 129 times. There's some reporting about this. those kids stay in the Bay Area and work for Google, then this is the point at which my undergraduates cringe when I say this, right? 18 years from now, you're at a party, you meet this other person. Okay, so, I don't need to spell that out. 15 years ago, when I was teaching at the University of Virginia, my colleague, a good friend, a guy named Paul Lombardo, who is the historian of eugenics in America, now at Georgia State University in the law school. He was giving a lecture at UVA Law School. A woman came up to me and said, so you're Professor Lombardo, you're talking about, the fact that you can get $50,000 to be an egg donor if you go to a fancy school. I think Yale actually has the record. I hate to tell you this. I think they were, the Yale undergrads were offered some crazy amount of money like this some years ago. This woman came up to my colleague Paul Lombardo after his lecture and said, Professor Lombardo, I'm a candidate. And she's tall, and she was an athlete, and very smart, UVA Law School, probably law review. He said, really? Yeah. She said, I'm going to probably take a job in San Francisco. This is 15 years ago. And condos are really expensive there. So I could get a great down payment, on my condo if I just sold some eggs. And Paul said, well, I'm not an obstetrician, but it can be pretty funky, the hyperovulation risks and so forth. And she said, oh yeah, no, my father's an obstetrician. I know all about that. Physician, heal thyself. We're already interested in germline modification. There's an evolutionary biology view that basically you have all these subconscious filters that happen when you're deciding who to mate with, okay? Is that already germline modification? I don't know. If you read Plato's Republic, as some people in this room have read Plato's Republic, Plato was very interested in germline modification. He wanted to get the best to mate with the best to a kind of speed dating that they wouldn't know about. The rulers would just set it up, right? So, this is not a new idea, but we've kind of attached dollars to it in a way that the ancients did not. And what I love about this is, and by the way, I have not looked for these online, in the last few years I haven't looked for these online, but you can do some improvements that are related to your ethnicity or to purify your line or improve your line. So you can do these are people looking for Korean egg donors, Croatian or Slovenian, beautiful part of the world. I sort of understand that. And then there's this one. We're looking for an egg donor who's half Caucasian and half Asian Chinese. I don't even know what that means exactly, but they're looking for one, and I hope that they found one. So the response to people who say, well, look, germline modification, that's a bad thing. You get into eugenics, you get into crazy ideas about how you could improve the race or a race, if you believe in race, which I don't. Well, but we're already doing that, right? It's already illegal. We're in the Wild West when it comes to reproduction. And then, of course, there's the other side of this, which is that people who have achondroplasia. My close friend in college had achondroplasia, and although he's no longer living, he might well have wanted to have a baby with somebody who also had achondroplasia. You could manage to have a baby that looked very much like you. Gallaudet University in Washington is having a harder and harder time finding well-qualified young people for the university who are not hearing impaired, because so many people have now, they're getting cochlear implants, or they just don't want to go to Gallaudet and be culturally segregated anymore. But if a good colleague, some people in the room will know the name John Fletcher, the first bioethicist at the NIH, my predecessor at University of Virginia some years ago. John Fletcher grew up with hearing impaired parents, and he and his sister, trivia, his sister was Louise Fletcher, right, Nurse Ratched. They grew up in Texas, and they were the interpreters for their parents. I think John believed that his parents, if they could have had their way, would have wanted to have hearing impaired children, because they would have been fully part of the same culture. So what's good for the goose is good for the gander. Right? What counts as enhancement? Some of my friends on the right consider all these ideas sort of what they call liberal eugenics. This is old news now for us, but 10, 15 years ago, this was hot stuff, the Octomom and so forth. This is a picture of my kids. We didn't have any help with them, as I mentioned, but maybe they could have been better. So So here we are back to Asilomar. Two interesting questions for me. First, is this model still relevant? Is it even plausible? I asked a French colleague, a very distinguished guy named Hervé Schneeweiss, who's a big scientist in France, said, Hervé, how many French scientists were at Asilomar? He said, maybe 2, maybe 3. Maybe there are 4 or 5 Brits, you know. It was all Americans. It was 90+% American. That world does not exist anymore. The world of 1970s biotechnology in which you could just call a meeting, call up your friends and have them come to Asilomar, and the 120 plus participants would all be American, and you could decide what the rules were for the rest of the world. That doesn't happen anymore. That's not possible anymore. It's different. But the concerns that they had, the substantive concerns, and the background political concerns are still relevant, right? So, just for example, the Cambridge City Council was very worried about recombinant DNA in Cambridge. The mayor of Cambridge dubbed this lab the Frankenstein lab, right? What if these little critters got out of the lab and ate Cambridge, which might not be a terrible thing, although it would have been hell for real estate values. So this model just, this is a different world now. So what are the responses? So the World Health Organization, I think completely reasonably, has put together a committee. This is what we do, right? We put together committees. And the committee's still working. I understand they're going to have a report pretty soon, but their first action is to create a voluntary registry of people who are doing anything along the lines of human genome editing, including the germline. And that's a very good idea. There should be such a registry. Unless you know something I don't know, it's voluntary. In fact, the scientific community globally pretty much works according to a sense of common standards. The national academies also the science academies globally have a committee going that is also doing work along these lines, kind of a parallel track. But then, on the other hand, there's a feeling among some people that this doesn't go far enough. That it's not just a matter of keeping track of what's going on, or perhaps kind of green lighting, yellow lighting some projects along the lines of germline editing. We actually should have a moratorium, period, end of story. We should just say no more gene-edited babies until some point, at which what? I'm not sure at what point. I can tell you a little backstory that I don't think the National Bioethics Advisory Commission back in the late 90s, and I did not work on this project, so I don't necessarily have any special information, but I actually do from having lunch conversations with some of them. The NBAC, the National Bioethics Advisory Commission, when it said no reproductive cloning, the basic argument was that it's unsafe. It's unsafe for the fetuses, unsafe for the mothers. We'd seen it took 100 of attempts to get Dolly, and so forth. Meanwhile, that field, by the way, the veterinary field has really moved on in reproductive cloning. We're getting really nice, big, juicy cattle now for beef, while we're making non-beef from pea plants. But nonetheless, that field has really moved on. Once you establish safety, then you're just, it seems to me, in normative territory. If we can ever establish safety for these fields, then it's only a question of what we think is morally acceptable. If it's not about safety, it's really then a question of where should we go with this. And I think that was true of cloning as well. Then you have people like David Baltimore who say, this moratorium idea, forget it. Not going to happen. That won't work. There's quite an interesting division right now in the scientific community about this question of whether you just say no, stop this entirely, or let's see kind of how this goes. Let's kind of track it like a global observatory sort of concept, and see who's doing what to whom, and we'll adjust our position as we go along. So those are the views. Now, what about HJK? This to me is so interesting. He's supposedly under some form of house arrest. We don't know exactly what that means. he's lost his job at the Southern University of Sciences, a very distinguished place, and he's lost his grants. He hasn't been charged with a crime. It's not clear that there was any standard or rule that applied in China that applied to what he was doing. And a side note, as you probably know, he probably failed in his scientific goal. Maybe we'll come back to that. One of the twins is probably mosaic, and there are a lot of reasons that, technically speaking, he really didn't achieve his goal. Nonetheless, quite apart from all that, when I was at the World Congress of Bioethics last year, a Chinese colleague said to me, you know, there actually was a rule that would have covered him. But that rule applies to medical faculty. He was in the science faculty. He was not in a medical faculty. He was in a science faculty. I said, oh, that's really fascinating. That hasn't, I haven't seen anybody report that. I don't know if it's accurate. I like to give a lot of inaccurate information in my talks. So, you know, just add that to the list. But, you know, that's the kind, that could well be true. He was a biophysicist by training. Right? So what went wrong? Well, he didn't make the CCR5 gene modification he wanted to make. He didn't get to delta 32. Somebody can explain to me what that is. But that particular version of the protein he didn't manage to change. The consent process was really kind of laughable. Apparently, even by their own reports, it was ridiculous. The couples were told that it was like a vaccine. Well, it's not really like a vaccine. He was motivated, by the way, as you may know, because he said that he saw men who were unable to have babies the old-fashioned way because they had HIV. Well, there are lots of ways to prevent transmission of HIV other than this. The hospital committee that was in charge, in theory, said he had not received approval. And then there was an implicit global consensus, I think, against germline editing, even though I haven't been able to find that big black line between somatic cell editing and germline editing. I think he did pretty much violate a global consensus against doing this. So what's going on here? Well, it depends who you talk to. I'm going to China in December with our colleague Steve Jaffe to talk to, among other things, to talk to people, try to get caught up on what's going on in China with respect to these issues. So who do you trust, right? So this is a very able science writer, John Cohen, who just said a couple of months ago, Chinese government really hasn't done much. Maybe he's in house arrest, he's lost his grants, he's lost his job. Where is he? What's he doing? Don't really know. Very feeble institutional response. They promised inquiry. There really is no inquiry. By the way, if there is, ever is an inquiry, how many, I don't know if anybody in this room is an IVFer, but how many people in IVF were involved in this project? I mean, that was where the real work was done, right? And nobody has been named. Not a single name has emerged except Dr. He. And I would guess that no other names will emerge, except maybe in a memoir, when I won't be here. But I think our colleague Hank Greeley at Stanford in a recent paper has really said something important. And that is, we have to avoid in these kinds of discussions getting to some kind of nationalist, racist black hole. I am old enough to remember in the late 1980s when Japan was going to take over the world, and we knew they would because they bought Rockefeller Center, right? I'm not kidding. Rockefeller Center, oh my God, catastrophe. Well, actually, as a business practice, that deal worked out very badly for the people who purchased Rockefeller Center. But I was hearing really, crazy, nasty things in meetings about Japanese motivations, even Japanese scientists, really crazy stuff. And I think Hank is right to warn us that we have to be very careful about kind of a new, the yellow peril of biotechnology. So I want to flag that. And by the way, it's not just the PRC that we're talking about here in the US and the PRC. Okay, so we're about 40 minutes into the talk. If I have not yet convinced you that this is a geopolitical topic, these two slides should do it. Otherwise, I have nothing else to offer you. So this, as you may know, is a Russian scientist, not a small person, a well-funded, distinguished scientist who says, hell no, I will go. That's a play on, hell no, I won't go. I will go. I'll go to gene editing. We're going to push push ahead on this. I am tired of the dithering. I'm tired of the dithering of the international scientific community on this. We have to move ahead. So what is this? This headline was great. Some headline writer had a really good time. A slight exaggeration, but not maybe, a complete exaggeration. You know this story? So the future of genetically modified babies may lie in Putin's hands. Side note, one of my other interests is emerging technologies in the military. And Putin has for years been really interested in psychotronic warfare. Do you know what that is? So psychotronic warfare is sort of, it's not exactly, like using ultrasound or something to disable your brain, right? So Putin is actually talking about having a psychotronic weapon. This was like 10 years ago. So maybe now he's thinking about having a germline modified weapon. What would that be? Would that be some super soldiers that, 18 years from now, they turn out to be incredible, incredible fighters? I'm not sure what he has in mind. But, there's something to this. This is Maria Vorontsova. Maria Vorontsova, Dr. Vorontsova, is Putin's eldest child. And she is a scientist. And she has gotten together with a number of biotechnologists, another geneticists in Moscow. And there was a meeting a few months ago. Asilomar, Asilomar, Moscow. And it turns out that she has a strong interest in bioethics. Now, as my colleagues in the department know, we're going to have the International Congress of Bioethics is going to be at Penn next June. I think we ought to invite her. We should make her a keynote speaker, right? That would get us on the front page of something. President Putin's daughter. So I don't know what to tell you about this, but I didn't make this up. You can look it up. It's got to be true. It's on the web. And so she's, she may be the most powerful bioethicist in the world at the moment, even more than Zeke. Okay, so getting toward the end here. So China has proposed new regulations. They appear to be quite serious. They're regulations that would have covered the HJK case. By the way, HJK has never been able to publish his data, right? You know why? It's unethical. No journal will take it. This is like serious paradox, right? Okay, but new regulations. They've got a big national advisory committee on this now that I think will pay attention to this. By the way, we still have junk stem cell clinics in this country that the FDA hasn't gotten its arms around, right? We're not necessarily in a better position than anybody else to throw stones at the ethics of biotechnology. And here's just briefly, there's a new personality rights section in China that's, I believe, still in draft form. And I just circled this. The new draft is going to step further in regulating scientific studies related to human genes or embryos by banning such activities from harming public interests. And it goes on that people who do such work will be covered by the new regulations and statutes. And the public interests should not be harmed. And I take it that the public interests, again, goes back to the question of modifying the germline. I haven't talked about some of the other philosophical issues about germline modification. Who owns the germline? If you look at there is a UN Declaration on the Human Genome and Human Rights. I think it's 2005. The human germline, in the terms of the UN, is considered to be kind of the common heritage of humankind. And therefore, we all have a stake in the germline and sort of what our descendants' characteristics are. So we can leave it to the UN to enforce that. And then we have the sort of the hard dollars and cents and scientific ambition, national scientific ambition side of geopolitics. So what does the PRC want to say about its position on these issues? What does it want to say to the world? Right? So we know that, look, China is going to be, the PRC is going to have the biggest GDP in the world in a few years. They're already publishing more papers than we are. Right? So how are they doing? Well, they're still pretty far behind, interestingly. It's a little slow. It's slower in biologicals and biotechnology, it being catching up to us, but they're moving along. It's slower than it is in some other fields, but they're betting big. They have huge national investment in science, particularly in the life sciences, but not only the life sciences. And we are not. We're fallen below the 2% of GDP. That's kind of the standard measure of investment in science and technology, which ought to be a top 3 issue in the presidential campaign, but there will be no issues in the presidential campaign, so far as we can tell. It should be a big issue. It should be because, as I've argued elsewhere, and I will not bore you with at the moment, science and technology have driven the U.S. economy, arguably since the telegraph and the telephone and the rails. More geopolitics, right? We have the professors who the FBI told the NIH to fire in Texas. There's at least one other individual who has had to leave Emory University. We see these stories once in a while. Is this about intellectual property? Is it about building super soldiers? I think it's about intellectual property, actually. But the whole business, and running out of time, the whole business of trade secrets in science is a weird thing, right? Because anybody in the room who works in science knows that science is not a zero-sum game, particularly after the 1980s, 1990s. It's a globalized endeavor. So what counts as a trade secret in science? If our pen colleague publishes a paper with a colleague in Beijing, how's that a trade secret? This is a really complicated stuff. So I presume that when this happens, we have to suppose that what's going on is some very specific engineering matter. But nonetheless, it raises really hard epistemological questions about how science progresses globally and what counts as a trade secret. Now, just to end, we do have a common interest, right? The common interest is in we don't want to make new biological weapons. The old biological weapons are fine, thank you very much. Anthrax, smallpox, we don't need more of them. But there has been a concern over the decades that you could make really, really funky biological weapons. So, for example, in the late 1980s, early 1990s, there were rumors that the South Africans during the apartheid regime were interested in combining the flu with Ebola. If you could figure out how to do that, you could get an easily transmissible, highly contagious disease that would also be fatal. That would be a very powerful weapon of terror. Not really going to win a war for you, but a terror weapon would be very effective. So we do not need to add to the official select agent and toxins list. This is the list for those of you who haven't been following it recently. There's a lot of pretty bad stuff that's in the world already. So, and by the way, I don't know if you noticed that it was about 3 weeks ago. There are only 2 labs in the world that still have smallpox, right? One's in Atlanta, one's at the Vector Lab in the former Soviet Union. Did you notice there was a fire in the Vector Lab 3 weeks ago? Not good, right? Not a good thing. Not a good thing to have a fire in a lab that has, now presumably if there was any smallpox in that part of the complex, it burned up, right? But nonetheless, you worry about the management of that facility. So this is the list. It's a long list. It's a lot of nasty things. We already know that there have been episodes and that I don't have time to talk about in terms of making stuff in the lab. So there was this episode at Stony Brook 17 years ago that was reported in Science. Okay, Science magazine explained how they did this. I was on an advisory group through the National Academies for Homeland Security at this time. And the Homeland Security people went crazy. They said to David Kennedy, who was the editor of Science at that time, "Are you out of your mind? Are you crazy publishing this?" Right? Interesting. There's a cultural difference between the engineers and the physicists and the people in the life sciences. David Kennedy's response was basically, okay, classify it. If you classify it, we won't publish it. Just classify it. He said, wait a minute. You can't classify everything. So, everything, you have to use some judgment. So there was an interesting cultural clash here between the physics and engineering have grown up since World War II in a national security environment. The life sciences, not so much. Right? So we don't necessarily quite think about that the same way. So we have this really ugly term, Dirk. I'm going to wrap it up. I'm not going to say anything more about any of this except to say that there are good reasons to worry about biosecurity and publication. There are people in this room who know more about this than I do. This is an old debate that I will not talk about. There are good things happening. Our friends at Johns Hopkins are having meetings in their biosecurity area with Shenzhen University. And I will only say, I told you that George Church, one of the few major defenders, I would say, of HJK and the gene editing in China, the germline editing, he did say this, which I pointed out to him in a talk that I gave a couple of years ago. I'm not sure he remembered that he wrote this, but still worth worrying about. Okay, sorry, I got to say this last thing because this is the whole reason for this talk. When I was growing up being taught philosophy in the 60s and 70s, 1960s, 1970s, there was virtual unanimity among philosophers coming out of World War II and coming out of the Stalinist crimes. Why are we the best in science in the West? Because we have open societies. Right? We have an open society. An open society is required for good science. I don't know who makes that argument now. It is possible to have pretty good science in relatively closed, highly scrutinized societies. And that maybe is the most important thing that we are going to have to come to terms with as we go on. Thank you. That'll be the day. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, but I mean, I think if we totally give up, then we're really screwed. Look, there are some ways in which we have put up significant obstacles, moral obstacles, right? So, willy-nilly experimenting on human beings. We don't do that, right? Not willy-nilly. We still do it. I'm not saying we don't, but I mean, there are rules, right? And for the most part, people follow the rules. And if you don't follow the rules, you may not get your grant renewed, you may not get published, you may not get promoted, right? So there's something. I mean, it's better than nothing. And I just think that it's better. It's good to have better than nothing. We can talk about this some more if you like, but I'm not sure it's all that bad. And I think the alternative to having some standards is the public gets pissed off, and you are ultimately dependent on the public in various ways as scientists, and even worse, the politicians get annoyed. And we saw what happened with somatics on nuclear transfer, 15 years ago, when when the Bush administration limited the funding to what turned out to be 21 cell lines, right? So how much more progress would have been made from 2001 to 2008 if there had been dozens of more cell lines available for NIH funding? I don't know, maybe not much, but still. So I wouldn't want us to give up the ghost. But we can talk about it more. Richard. Well, indeed. One thing I did want to, seems like you guys have to talk about, one difference is, and I'm not the first one to point this out, the first mover needs to articulate the rules. And in the case of nuclear weapons, we didn't articulate the rules. Right? And this is a complicated story, but as you know, people like Oppenheimer J. Robert Oppenheimer, who was involved in the Manhattan Project, really wanted the U.S., after Hiroshima and Nagasaki to say, okay, these are the rules and we're going to stick by these rules. And we never did that. So our hopes of managing stuff in a way that doesn't create a lot of big problems really depend to a great extent on making sure that whoever has the goods, which is us and the French and the British and the Chinese and the Japanese and maybe Singapore and maybe Israel, that we decide what the rules are and make them public and go by them. Now, by the way, there's a whole big difference between nuclear weapons, which worry me a hell of a lot more than gene-edited babies. Right? They're much more worrisome. I mean, so we have to be careful. Immanuel Kant said, "You're prisoners of your examples." Right? So, anybody else? I think we got somebody gestured. No? So I think we're out of time now. Yeah, I'm not much of a normative philosopher. But look, I think that if take cystic fibrosis or sickle cell. If we don't make a lot more progress in these two, important autosomal recessive disorders for which, if we don't make a lot of progress in other ways, and if this is the only way to manage them, I think it's something that seriously be discussed. Having just been through the sickle cell committee, it's very much on my mind, but hydroxyurea therapy maybe cuts down the crises by 50%, not great. 50% of a sickle cell crisis is still a terrible crisis. It's still disabling. There's bone marrow transplants that work for some people, actually curative for some people, but not for a lot of people. So if there's no other good options and I want to get it out of my germline, I think we'd be willing to consider that. Sir? Me neither. Yes, I should have said it much more clearly. The question here is, what's the signal that, for example, the PRC wants to send to the rest of the world? Right? It seems to me the signaling is what's interesting here. Is the signal, we're on the cutting edge and we're going to push ahead. I actually had a conversation with a Chinese academic who is not he's a public policy guy, he's not in this world. He's at Fudan University. And this is like 8 months ago or something. And I said to him, okay, he said, well, I don't understand this whole gene editing thing. I tried to explain it to him, a philosopher explaining it to a public policy guy, but you can imagine how awful that was. And but he said, well, to innovate, you have to be flexible. Innovate, you have to be flexible. And I think there is a feeling, maybe more in other parts of the world than here, that innovation is the signal we want to send to the rest of the world. We are on a beeline of it. If I'm I know the reaction in China was uniformly negative in the science world, totally pissed off at HJK, right? But I would imagine that in the Ministry of Science there was a minority view that said, well, let's see how this plays out. We are moving in a powerful direction here. China they're on all cylinders right now. From investment in technology to the Belt and Road Initiative, right, to not getting involved in our politics, smart move. They are moving ahead. And this is a headline area, right? This is a headline field. What's the message we want to send to the rest of the world? How we are intent on being the leading voice, the leading force in biotechnology. And is this an area where we really need to send that signal? Thank you for asking the question. Thank you.